Good afternoon to you, Mark Sutter with HurricaneTrack.com. Here it is Monday, the 14th of August, 2023. We have a lot to talk about today on the update. The tropics are starting to wake up. There are a couple of areas to watch in the eastern Atlantic. Neither of them am I too concerned about, but I'm more concerned with what might be happening over towards the Gulf of Mexico, maybe in about a week's time, maybe less. We'll see. Also, of course, the Eastern Pacific, very busy right now. We have Fernanda out there, we have Greg, and we have another one that's going to develop off the coast of Mexico that has the potential to be a very powerful, large hurricane just off the coast of Mexico. Could send some swells up towards the Baja, so you surfers down at Cabo, you're going to love that, and elsewhere along the Mexican Pacific coast, maybe even all the way up to Southern California. So a lot to talk about, a couple of very interesting things. I try to bring you some, kind of tidbits of what's happening elsewhere related to the tropics, that kind of stuff. And I got some interesting things along those lines for today as well. All right, good to have you along. Let's get started, shall we? First, yesterday, this is an infographic made up by our back-end team member, CJ. Yesterday was the 19th anniversary of Hurricane Charlie, and it made landfall at Cayo Costa, which is exactly where Ian made landfall 18 years later. Very, very similar tracks overall, but two entirely different results when all was said and done, owed to the fact that Ian was much larger, both of them making landfall at 150 miles per hour and 941 millibar pressure readings. Pretty remarkable, 18 years apart. Yes, Hurricane Charlie, a lot of you remember that. A lot of you got your start in really admiring the power, the uniqueness, and the mysterious nature of hurricanes because of Charlie. There's usually a big pivotal weather event that gets people interested in weather. For a lot of people in the Northeast, it's some kind of a blizzard. For people in the Midwest, it's a tornado outbreak or a singular tornado. And in the South and Gulf Coast and Atlantic region, and sometimes in the Northeast, because you do get hurricanes like Gloria in 1985, Bob in 1991, that affected parts of New England and vicinity, but mostly in the South, it's hurricanes. It certainly was for me. And just to remind you, we do have a documentary about it. As poor quality as it may be, this is from a long time ago, so it's all pixelated and just, I wish I could render out a better one, but I don't think I can, even from the original DVD. Maybe I'll give it a shot one day, but it is sitting over on YouTube. Just search for Bonnie and Charlie HurricaneTrack. It's from the 2004 Tracking the Hurricanes documentary, the very first one that I ever produced. My own original music, my own narration, and my own, 33 back then? So yeah. All right, moving on along. This is the first of the interesting things that I wanted to show you. Well, maybe the Charlie thing was interesting too, but this is what things looked like a year ago, 2022. And we were talking about the very warm high latitudes up here. We all remember that. Those anomalies up there were close to the right-hand side of the anomaly scale. 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius, warmer than normal, and a lot of conversation was made about it. What could it mean? What could it do to distort the pattern? We had this, what we call anticyclonic wave breaking that was going on. Everybody's like, what is that? And it was creating a very hostile environment in the Atlantic Basin as a whole. And we ended up going through August last year with 0 named storms, despite the fact that it looked like 2022 would be a very active season. Most forecast agencies calling for a very busy season last year. And a lot of that was because of this right through here, the warm anomalies down in the deep tropics. But it kind of got backwards, right? And we saw what happened. We had a 0 named storm August. Once we got to September, things did get busy. And of course, we ended up with Fiona and Ian, 2 different reasons why both of those were very devastating for the respective regions that they hit. But yes, last year was kind of like weird in a way. Shows a couple of instances where it only takes one, right? So let's just look at this year. It is much different. We've lost the concentrated stripe, if you will, zone up here, and it's more widespread, the warmth overall, but it is generally more focused down here. I think you can see that. You got some pretty warm anomalies way up in the far northern Atlantic, but the distribution is different than what we saw last year. And another big part of last year is we had this cold anomaly that kind of stretched through the subtropics, and it just goes to show you that each year is different. I don't know exactly how this is going to end up affecting everything. Nobody does, literally, and I'm going to prove that to you in just a little bit, because also we have the El Nino this year, mostly in the eastern Pacific. There's some warming out here in the central, but a very different pattern for a lot of reasons overall. And I also want to point this out, and this is very concerning. It really is. Last year, the Gulf of Mexico was at or slightly below normal, just a few areas there of very slightly above normal temperatures. And as you are well aware, this year the Gulf of Mexico is markedly warmer than we are used to seeing. Related to the El Nino over here in El Nino news, as if this was a news show, you'd see that little animation and it would come on screen. It might have a little sound effect. El Nino news. This is the subsurface plot of anomalies, and it's like if you took a slice right out of the equatorial Pacific and then looked at it, this is what it would look like. If you go down from the surface, which is at the top, to about 450 meters deep at the bottom of the chart, these are your anomalies. We're starting to develop these holes now, much more of this erosion of the really thick and potent subsurface anomalies. And let's put this back into motion. This is a GIF animation, and I think I can just refresh the page and we're going to be back in business. Look at where it has come from and where we are now. And so this really shows us that the strongest of the El Nino is over here in the eastern Pacific, not widespread all the way across, and there's not more of this. I've pointed this out a lot recently. You don't have this sitting over here waiting to come over and join up and just have this giant area of 4, 5 plus anomalies down there in the subsurface. It's just not there. So I think that the El Nino will continue to strengthen. I mean, that's what most of the guidance shows us, but its time is going to be limited. I don't think we're going to have a multi-year El Nino. That doesn't seem to be shaping up, certainly not in the subsurface here. We're getting changes already showing that we're going to peak in the fall, maybe in the winter, early winter, and then, and I know it's still 2023, but as we go into 24, we should lose the El Nino. So just something to think about as we go forward. In the Gulf of Mexico, I continue to just be marveled at this and concerned for a variety of reasons. I guess there's a term called varieties, but yes, a variety of reasons. I spoke to my colleague and friend Greg Nordstrom. He lives over here in Mississippi. We talked for about an hour and a half last night about all kinds of things, most of it related to weather. And he said that he has lived there a long time, many, many years, either in Starkville, which is, of course, inland, but he's been down at the Gulf Coast now for several years. He's visited the Gulf Coast. He knows Mississippi weather. And, you know, it's not hyperbole to say he has never felt it this hot before down there. The dew points at night staying up very high, more than 80 degrees in some instances. The air just isn't cooling off. There's a lot of energy in the air, and that is coming from, a lot of it, this very warm Gulf of Mexico, warmer than we have ever seen it in the human existence, where we've been able to measure this stuff. So since we've had scientific instruments, thunder, nice. It's Thor right outside my window. Who would have thought? Ever since speaking of instruments, right? Ever since we've had instruments to measure this stuff, it's never been this warm. You know, look, if we go back 1,000 years or 100,000 years, look, that's, of course, we don't know. But since we've been here in the United States as a country, you know, since settlement times, whatever you want to call it, no, we have never seen it like this. And certainly in my career and in my lifetime, and I'm just a little bit over 50 years old, I've never seen it like this. And it's problematic for the obvious reason that we could get some very intense hurricanes if the atmosphere cooperates. But you can get very intense hurricanes with simply 80-degree water that's right where it should be. no anomalies needed. We saw that in other instances. We don't have time to get into that today. This just makes it easier. And more importantly, perhaps, it's not just the intensity we're talking about. People are always, and I understand it, naturally focused on wind and pressure. How strong is it? How strong do you think one could get? And I focus on that maybe unnecessarily too much myself, because we do have to remember the rest of the impacts. And the one big impact that I see outside of an intense hurricane with a big surge, that could be very possible, is rainfall of epic proportions. We saw what happened with Harvey now coming up on 6 years ago, right? And the tremendous rains from that, 5 feet in some isolated areas of actual accumulated rain. I was there, I saw it. And this is the kind of pattern that could give you that if a system were to stall. So I'm worried about the rainfall from even a weak tropical storm, a depression, a tropical low, or a hurricane that hits the brakes as it makes landfall and doesn't move very quickly. Precipitable water in the atmosphere, the dew point, all of that's related. The heat out here, it's more than just what's in the ocean itself. It's more than what you see on the surface. And it's really becoming a problem. It's making life uncomfortable down here, especially at night, especially for those who just don't have the means to cool off. It is a really big problem, hurricanes notwithstanding. We get any of those taking advantage of this, and we could have some unbelievable problems. And we need to just kind of start wrapping our brain around that possibility. Another thing that I have not seen, I had to check and make sure, I have never seen, that I can remember, a 31 Celsius isotherm poking up on this particular map. I've used this map for many, many, many years. I look at it in the wintertime when we look at the temperature gradient that's out here, when you get all the cold air in the Northwest Atlantic making the ocean cold, and then you got the Gulf Stream, you get that gradient. Well, yeah, we look at that in the winter when we're looking for wintertime winter storm bombs, as they call them, those bomb cyclones. But in the summer, we're looking at this for sea surface temperatures related to potential hurricane impacts. And once in a while, you see the 30 degrees Celsius snake up here, but I don't think that I've ever seen 31 Celsius. You know, we're talking upper 80s. I just don't think I've ever seen that before. So we're only at August 14th today. Today's the 14th. Still have 2 weeks left in the month. Unless we get some unusually strong cold front coming down and mixing this out, or a tropical cyclone coming through, these water temperatures on the East Coast could continue to go up. And then when we get to September, when we are climatologically more favored anyway, we could really be looking at the potential for some problems along the East Coast. I just feel like, in one sense, the dominoes are all getting lined up and ready to be knocked over in a way that we're not necessarily prepared for. It's just like everything has been pretty much to the extreme this year. The temperatures for some areas have been cooler, certainly, but where the extremes have occurred, they haven't been just a little bit, they've been a lot. We have seen record severe weather, record hail, not really a lot of intense tornadoes, but certainly more tornadoes in July and August than I think we've seen in a long time. Just scrolling through Twitter, I've seen lots of chasers. They're still out there. Last night, you guys know this guy, Jeff Petrowski, the famous Harvey car wash guy. He's a friend of mine. Saw him just a couple months ago over in Texas or New Mexico or somewhere. Me and CJ ran into him after a very brief tornado near the Texas-New Mexico border. But he was on Twitter last night streaming live in a tornado-warned storm somewhere in the Midwest. Like, it's August. It all should have lifted up into the plains of Canada by now. And it has, but it's still going on in the deep south. So my point is, well, further south. My point is, everything just seems to be, it's either not happening at all, or when it does, it's on the extreme side of things. And I just think what we're seeing, with everything lining up towards the climatological peak of the hurricane season, I'm getting a little concerned that it's all just going to tip and go into that realm of just very intense activity, even if we don't hit the so-called numbers. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. So let me get off my, I don't know what you call that, a mid-update monologue, and let's get moving, all right? and the Atlantic Basin. Just a lot on my mind, and I like to share it with you. I don't want to hide anything from you. All right, this is what I'm thinking about. This is what I'm talking to my colleagues about. So I'll share it with you. Over the next 2 days, nothing to be concerned with. Over the next 7 days, still nothing to be concerned with. But this is a sign that perhaps the African tropical waves, they originate over Africa, these easterly waves of energy, are getting to be a little bit more robust as they come off. The atmosphere out here is getting a little bit better suited, and we might see some development in the eastern Atlantic. But I'm also a little bit worried about what could be happening over here. Several days down the road, we will also take a look at that. Meanwhile, in the East Pac, we have Fernanda, a very powerful hurricane out here. That too could already start to send some swells over the next several days up towards our friends along the Baja and parts of Mexico, maybe up to southern Cal. We'll look at that maybe on Wednesday when we can get some more data from NOAA and their surf forecast and so on. Surfers down here, yeah, we might have an interesting few days for you. And then speaking of Greg, I got two friends named Greg. One works at Fox Weather, the other is down at Mississippi, works at MSU. But there's Tropical Storm Greg in the East Pac, and then this one is really going to be a doozy once it does develop, and I'll show you that as we move forward. Briefly on our hurricane tracking chart, this is our interactive map. This, by the way, is available and crowd-sourced by our partners over on our Patreon-supported site at HurricaneTrack Insider. It is like the paywall side. I hate that term with a passion. But this is what our members have access to. The people that fund what we do, you get the goodies because you are the people that invested in it. That's the way it should be. And this map is really, really nice. Very interactive. Everything's, as they say, mouse-overable. Interactive. That's why it's called the interactive map. But anyway, there's Fernanda, forecast to head out in the general direction of Hawaii. And look, I know with what's going on in Maui, there's a lot of angst about any type of disruption to the norm, the new norm that they're going to have to deal with out there. No real worries from any of these systems in terms of extra wind or problems with that. And if anything does arise, I think the hyper-focus on it will be such that everybody will be ready. We can only hope. But right now, no real worries, even though you do see these cones of uncertainties. At least Greg will pass fairly far to the south, and it'll be much weaker than Dora. By the way, Dora's influence on those winds was just a tiny part of the overall package that led to those terrible fires that are still going, in some instances, smoldering in Maui. Dora was only a little bit of that. Not going to get into that right now because that's not the purpose of today's update. But do not worry too much about Greg. Much weaker, and any high to the north, any pressure gradient, that's what the part of the cause was, is that gradient between high and low pressure. You had downsloping winds and so forth. Greg won't be able to contribute to that very much as it passes well to the south. All right, satellite animation of our different features here. There's Fernanda. Greg is just off the satellite realm over here to the left. This is the next system that's going to come together and be a very large and powerful hurricane somewhere in this vicinity over the next several days. Yes, the GFS and the Canadian from time to time, we're bringing this up towards this part of North America. And I was like, is my first hurricane mission this year actually going to be for a dying hurricane coming into the desert Southwest or even California? Probably not, but there were a few days there where it was interesting, and I texted a couple of my colleagues out west. I was like, seriously? But we'll watch and see. Again, I think this big one here, it will be a big one and an intense one, could create some really big swells. But look at this. Really? In August? Like, all of that should be up in Canada. You know, we should have big high pressure dominating big old Atlantic subtropical ridge, but we're getting these systems, these troughs coming in that are undercutting different areas of high pressure. There's a pretty stout area sitting down here that's keeping the deep south and Gulf Coast hot and dry. Some monsoonal moisture out west, but then this subtropical jet, well, it's not even subtropical, just westerly wind energy bringing in these troughs. Just kind of unusual to see in the month of August. All right, looking out to the east, yep, still a lot of African dust and generally stable air all through here, but to the south, things are gradually changing. Look at the calendar. Look at the date. It is the 14th. Yes, 6 days can make a huge difference. That is why we have climatology. It's that last third of August. Anytime after the 20th, things usually start to crank in the Atlantic because a lot of this gets mixed out, and it literally can change from one day to the next. It's not like you have no hurricanes on Friday and 2 of them on Saturday. That's not what I'm talking about. But overnight, it's like, hey, look at all the convection out there. Look at the more moisture, the less Saharan air layer. That can happen really fast. And I think we're starting to see that overall, and the models are starting to pick up on it. Let me switch over to the Eastern Pacific just to knock that out real quick. This right here is Fernanda. Greg is over here off the side. And this is that next area. Look how large an area of just general turning that we're seeing right here with this next system that's going to develop in the East Pac. And then watch what happens as we move this out into time. Fernanda continues on out of the picture, but then the next one develops, heads up close enough to the Baja that it will certainly bring in some huge swells, and it looks pretty intense overall. And then it gets close enough still that I think at this juncture, of course we're talking about 8 days out, but Southern Cal is right there, and those south-facing beaches, whatever's left of this, could send some swell activity up your way. So we'll watch for that over the next several days, certainly. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, not a lot going on out here. We still have the dry air, the overall, even dust. You know, the dust is thicker than we've seen lately. Probably the thickest of the year, but nonetheless, stuff's starting to change generally. And let's just see what happens. Just move this out over the next week or so. There we are, 168 hours. So a week from today, August 21st, nothing on this map that says, all right, the switch has been flipped. But in a week, it could look different. Like what the model sees today, and remember, this is just guidance, could be a lot different than the reality a week out. In other words, the model showing nothing, you know how people say, like, let's just say that it showed a big hurricane somewhere. You would say, well, that's a week away. It might not show anything in a week's time. But the same has to also be said when it shows nothing. You know what I mean? The rules have to apply across the board. You look at this and you go, well, there's really nothing there. A week from now, there still may be nothing there, but there could also be 1 or 2 systems that are very interesting. You know, it does work both ways. And I think the overall guidance package from everything, the Canadian, the Euro, the GFS, there's a lot of stuff that's trying to be worked out within the model physics, the climatological shift towards the normal ramping up, the dry air versus all of the warmth of the Atlantic, these large systems that are coming off Africa. It's very, very complex. So even though we don't see anything today, on the GFS anyway, doesn't mean that there will be nothing there. And just to kind of show you what, I don't want to call it proof of that, because I don't know what's going to happen for sure, but the CMC, the Canadian, same model area, 850 millibars. Let's look at this at a week's time, and you get, well, somewhat of a different story. You know, like, is it accurate? Is it more suffering convective feedback? I don't know. We'll see. Let's look, you know, in a week, let's see who was right. I'll save both these images from the GFS and the Canadian. Let's see which one is right, because you've got an interesting area there, certainly one there. And then this one, in a week, that could be problematic over those very warm waters. And then another one, of course, in the Eastern Pacific. So yeah, some interesting things coming up along the way during a season that is very difficult to sort of pick apart and figure out. And I'm going to kind of start to wrap this up over at Storm 2K. They have a thread over there, expert forecast for the 2023 North Atlantic season. And just scrolling through this particular page, we're at page 12 of this year's version of this thread, and different forecasts and discussions and so forth. But let's scroll down all the way to the bottom, because I thought this was really interesting. This poster, this user here, Space Coast, I don't know who that is personally, but they make a very good point. You know, you can quote stuff here on these message boards, these old message boards. You got to love them, right? Why do most people here think that the season forecast will bust too high? And then this person, Space Coast, says, well, University of Arizona, aside from their robust forecast, and that was pretty high, you got to admit. Remember that one from way back in June? 25 named storms, 12 hurricanes, 6 majors. He says, aside from that, I'm perfectly comfortable with the other experts' ranges of anywhere from 18.8 and 3 to 19.9 and 6 and so forth, and I do not feel the need for additional accuracy in that regard. I like this one right here. This is so important. I am more interested in the where than exactly how many. And that's what it all comes down to. Then, what are the experts seeing that Storm 2K members don't, or vice versa? And I really, really appreciate, this is why I like this message board so much. There certainly seems to be a lot of uncertainty from the experts, and this person is a non-expert. I love that honesty, and I share that feeling, but I respect theirs. And this is from Colorado State's update the other day. Quote, we stress that there is considerable uncertainty with this season's outlook given the large spread and model guidance, as well as the uncertainty and exactly how the El Nino will interact with the extremely warm Atlantic. It is incredibly important to understand we are in an era that we have not dealt with before in the last 50 to 100 years. Let's just call it 50. Make it easy. My lifetime. The El Nino coming on, the record warmth in the Atlantic Basin that's above and beyond anything we have ever seen in modern history. Of course we are uncertain because we have not been dealt this deck of cards before. So take all of that into consideration as you move forward and work on your hurricane plans or whatever. We don't know. It's going to be a very interesting time ahead, and we'll try to figure it out together, all right? So that's what I'm looking at. That's how I do what I do. Whether or not we had YouTube and social media, I would do this regardless, you know? If I was the guy in Florida the other day that picked those 6 numbers on Mega Billions, I know it's called Mega Millions, but somebody's well, Uncle Sam made a lot of money. I would still do this. That's my point. And I just love the fact that I can share it with you all. This is what I look at every single day. I don't produce this for your benefit. In other words, not for the views and the hype. But, hey, we're all in it together. A lot of you follow what I say on YouTube, and I appreciate that very much. It's reflected in the views, but it's not about that. It's about, hey, let's talk about this together. And your comments, very similar to what we see on Storm 2K, in the YouTube comments, mostly very educational, very informed, and I really appreciate that. We got a good audience, we really do. All right, let's get this online for you so you can see it, and we'll take it from there. You guys have a good rest of your Monday. I'm Mark Sudduth over here at Hurricane Track. We'll do it again tomorrow.